Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Leon clowes. Looking forward to our conversation, Leon, today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Simon. It's great to be here.
So, as people will tell from Leon's accent, we've finally got another Brit on the show, and so that makes you pretty special, Leon. But you're even more special in the fact that you're the first guest I've ever met in person. So Leon and I met at Leeds train station last week, not by accident, right? It wasn't an accidental meeting. Leon was up here on doing some work at the university at Leeds Beckett. So I actually met a real, like a real adoptee, real face to face, and after 360 odd episodes, that makes you really special.
Well, I'm very honoured and privileged for that. Thank you. Yeah, it was great to meet you. Yeah. It was a very fortuitous thing because I'd picked up listening to your podcast that you may have a Yorkshire accent, and there I was visiting Leeds. And yeah, so that's no, it's great to see you on Zoom after that now.
Yeah. So one of the things that you said to me, so Leon's an artist, and it's you're a multidisciplinary.
Yeah, that's right.
So you work across different in different, what would you call it? Different fields, different.
I'd call it more transdisciplinary because I don't know. Multidisciplinary suggests to me that I'm actually accomplished in any of those things, and I wouldn't want to claim that in the slightest. Partly also because transdisciplinary to me means that because certainly at this point in my early re-emerging career, I'm 53, and I started making artworks, as I call them, 3.5 years ago. But I trained a long time ago in music. That was my degree back in like 1991. I finished that. But because a lot of my work currently at the moment deals with what I call lived grief, apart from it's separate to lived trauma. I initially started calling it trauma. So I'll use whatever medium is the right thing to kind of communicate the message or what I'm exploring. So it could be that storytelling was the way in that I looked at my family of origin story initially, and with my queer grief or trauma. I grew up gay during the time of AIDS, as that came out, and gay men were pilloried and despised quite a lot, really. So I'm using music with that because I wrote music at the time, kind of thing. So that's a kind of very loose and not very watertight description of what I call transdisciplinary.
We like that.
Yeah, let's keep it.
We like that. It gives you a certain freedom to go where you want to go. And I actually wrote transdisciplinary down, but then I didn't read it properly, and I said multidisciplinary. So there we are.
Fine. They're all just words, really. All just words, yeah. I make stuff, and I'm making it up as I go along. I think it's the general principle.
And that is what we're all doing, right? We're all making stuff as we go along, and people are telling us that that's not the way to do it, or if we are, unsure of the next step, then don't worry, because they've got the solution. And if we spend time and or money or both with them, they will help us get to where we want to be. But the truth is that we're all making it up all the time. So one of the things that you said, you mentioned it just now, and you mentioned it last week when we met at the coffee shop, was you don't use the word trauma anymore. And I thought, that's a really interesting place to start a conversation, because in the adoptee world, we're obsessed with trauma, aren't we?
And I think it's a wider obsession as well. And having just said that, I don't really mind if I'm called transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, and I don't really mind if people use capitals for my name or not, kind of thing. I write it all in lowercase, kind of thing. But I do think there is a thing about trauma that is like there are certain terms in our world that are overused quite a lot, and so trauma has all kinds of meanings and therefore ends up meaning nothing. To my mind, I mean, this is just my opinion, obviously. Another word that I also do, which is quite relevant to me, is addiction as well, because everybody's addicted to something. Everybody's had a trauma of some kind. And as Gabor Mate writes, trauma isn't the thing that happens to you, it's the wound it leaves behind and how that affects your present day. And so that's my kind of rationale on that. And that's part of the academic practice research that I'm doing at the moment, which is about, because I was born into a family that was traumatized by my very birth. And so I grew up in that, or in the not in the knowledge of who my father was. And but I think the word trauma, if we overuse it too much, it's too overpowering a word. It's that it's in our present. If it sounds a very overwhelming thing that I'm suffering from trauma, whereas if I use words like grief or pain or loss, to me that situates these terrible things that happened. I'm not denying that they weren't terrible, but I'd rather live, or try and aim to live, more in the present. So I've been informed by my grief, but I'm not ruled by it. That's very important for me, I think.
Yeah, it is overused. Definitely, the trauma word is, and I don't know, and it's overused, and I totally agree. It's overused culturally in the wider culture. It's not just the adoptee land. It's not just adoptee land that is kind of obsessed with it. These days, I believe that the adoption, a sector in the UK or industry in the US. Listen, when I speak to people in the US and they hear that adoption doesn't cost money in the UK, they are like, "What?" So there are some court fees that adoptive parents pay, but they don't pay like up to, I think the figures I have heard or I saw on a price list. I mean, the word. I even use the word priceless. It makes me really sick, actually, because it was different prices for different skin colors, different
Wow.
different different levels of ability or disability. And for me, this whole the price thing and the price thing that leads to trafficking, and similarities to trafficking, and similarities to kind of like, you've got a price on your head. It sounds a bit like slavery, right? In the States, I believe that adds another layer of trauma. It adds another layer of severe discomfort for American adoptees that we're kind of that doesn't apply to us here in
completely. I mean, I went to America in 2012, and I was more than ably assisted by our mutual connection, Joyce Maguire Pavo, who's amazing. I mean, I love her book, The Family of Adoption. That kind of had more impact on me, I think, than any other book in kind of terms of adoption, because it touched on my particular area, which is kinship care. But it was a completely different world to me. I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship, which anybody can apply for, and I visited 8 states in 6 weeks. And I, as a British person, I had no idea of the politicization. I don't know if that's the correct word that happens in America. So one of the most intense weeks of my life, or series of days in my life, was going to the conference in Denver, which was the AAC. I think the acronym is the American Adoption Congress, which is adoptee led, and it was it was a very intense room because there's, a lot of people who don't know their mothers, or in my case, my father, in a room, and that was probably perhaps not as intense as the drama conference I was at last week for different reasons, but it was, through Joyce, actually, she was amazing because she was my entry to so many experts in America. And I had so many great conversations and meetings with, but it's a completely different world, as you say, because in this country, I know I'm old enough that my social work records I was not allowed to sit. They were written because I was born in 1970. I think I've got this right, but until 1975, social workers would be writing about somebody like me I was actually formally adopted by my grandparents, which is a really rare thing. But there were a few adoption notes, but I was never supposed to see them. And then, of course, the law changed in 1975. And then actually Data Protection Act recently actually allowed me the full unredacted access to my records. And I only had that in January 2021. So I had requested my adoption records quite a few years before, after my grandfather died. So this was, or maybe it was, I can't remember, but I wasn't given the full records. So I do understand a little bit about the American experience, because whilst my father's name wasn't revealed in it, there was some pretty substantial evidence, I would say, that suggested what had actually happened within my family, that the secret as to who my father was had been hidden from me by my grandparents and mother, which is what the case was, kind of thing. So I do kind of I could kind of see, and I remember really vividly, like, meeting quite a lot of adoptees. I remember one man in particular, actually, at the AAC, who was just tortured because he knew he was never going to see his mother, or know who his mother was, kind of thing. And I could relate to, and he was, that I knew who my mother was. I grew up with her because she was my sister by adoption, kind of thing. Was just, you could see him really kind of grappling with this. But I experienced this to some degree because I was never to know who my father was, and was never supposed to, neither. So
yeah, wow. So before we started recording, you said that you've been in recovery, you've been sober for a long period of time, for the last 2 years, and you're saying, and I'm just putting that together with what you just said about getting your records in 2021. Is that a coincidence, or?
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Oh, sorry, I've actually got that wrong. It was 2022. I got my final records in 2022, which was after. But it does relate. The story does very much relate, actually, because my mother told me on her deathbed 10 years ago that she was sexually assaulted by her uncle. So my great uncle, a schizophrenic man, was who I met once as a child. I visited him in what we'd call a mental hospital at that time, and my grandparents took him because it was my grandmother's younger brother. But I was never supposed to know who he was, which you can understand coming from a village in 1970 in the Midlands. It took a few years, but having that last piece, or that major part of me, half of me, understanding that I'm an inbred, but it was better, I would say, knowing who my uncle, that my great uncle was my father, because it was this deep, dark secret, and obviously something awful had happened to this 14-year-old girl to be giving birth at that time in a small village. And it was obviously a big scandal, and I dare say more people knew about my background than I did, which was pretty destructive, I would say. I mean, I go to AA, and there's a whole thing in Alcoholics Anonymous where people say this is an illness, this is something you're born with. I don't think I entirely subscribe to that, because everybody I've met in whatever form of recovery I've had addictions to drugs and food and sex and, well, I mean, all of those things. I mean, they're all related to me, and overwork and all kinds of things. But I think we are all affected by trauma in some way. So that's why I would dare say, if you start scratching the surface, to anybody who's got addictions. I mean, we've all got addictions, but it's harder to control them, I think, if you have no sense of self, or very discombobulated, very messed up sense of self, like I had for a long time. And so it was kind of a relief when I actually started getting sober when I was 48. And because I knew I had to. I also know people who are in their early 50s and they're like, I can't drink anymore. It's kind of, just can't do it because physically it's tougher on you. But I got into the AA fellowship after my second relapse, because I could see I was starting to get back into being a creative practitioner again, rather than just going to the pub and resenting people that I was raising money for, because that's what I did for about 25 years. But I got a lot out of going to AA fellowships and doing the big book and doing the steps and getting an AA sponsor. I really needed that kind of community and support, and I probably identified much more with other addicts and alcoholics than I did maybe other queer people when I was growing up, or certainly the village where I was from and was bullied quite a lot and all of those kinds of things. So there is definitely a connection about not knowing who my father was, and I think that's been a really profound thing about me, my sense of self, my lack of identity, my want to people please, wanting to fix people, and make really poor judgments on friends and relationships, you know what I mean? And so I'm still kind of learning how to do that now at the grand old age of 53, you know.
So on your YouTube channel, so there's links to Leon's website and all his social media channels in the show notes, as always, listeners. I saw this, and it kind of relates to what you've just said. But I really loved its clarity and also its depth. So this is underneath one of your videos on YouTube, and you say, in healing and of hurting, I repress because I repeat, and forget because I repeat, as when days of future past are present, it is secrets that make us sick. Shame only dies on exposure. And I just thought that was, especially the last bit, I got the last bit. The other stuff, I thought, there's something here. I need to ask Leon about, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
That was the description I wrote, because that must be for the film Nesting, which was my final piece. Last year I was an associate artist at an art school in Margate, Open School East. It's a free MA. I was lucky enough to be one of the 14 selected for last year. So that was the film that was part of an installation. And nesting is the thing that addicts do when they surround themselves at the end of their addiction. So it's just the bottles, the chocolate, the drugs, whatever, and you isolate yourself from the rest of the world. So the phrase is called nesting, which I'd found out about from a company called Vita Nova, because I'm part of the Addiction Recovery Arts Network. So I've been finding out about all these different things. That description then was actually for the program, for the exhibition, which took place in June. And it's a combination. The repress and forget is actually a reference to, forgive my French accent here, Gilles Deleuze is difference and repetition. It's the English translation of it. And it's one of the key phrases I am kind of I've latched onto and I explore through my practice research. So my supervisor, Dr. Kathy Sloan at University of West London, London College of Music, has been kind of introduced me to lots of things like queer performance theory and the French philosophers and things like that. And I'm particularly drawn to Deleuze's 1968 book, Difference and Repetition, because a lot of my work involves repetition, as does recovery. And also as an addict, you're always repeating the same act. You're banging your head against the wall because you're going out and drinking every night and having a horrible hangover and whatever. But also being in recovery is all about repetition. Before we were talking, I was saying about how, because I've been all over in different places, I struggle with that sometimes because it makes me eat a lot because I'm not, I need a bit of regulation and safety. Days of Future Past is the X-Men. It's a comic I read. It's a film, actually. I've never seen the film, but I read it when I was 11 years old. And it really haunted me, that comic. And I remember my grandparents actually banned me from reading Marvel comics. I wasn't a DC fan, I was a Marvel comic superhero fan. And because that one gave me nightmares. Basically, the X-Men are all exterminated and all mutants or superheroes and supervillains. Anybody with any special power, there's an incident that happens, so Kitty Pryde has to go back to the past to fix the future that's coming, and the dates even align to very significant moments in my own life. So things like, I think in 1988, the Mutant Control Act was passed, which is when Section 28 was also passed, which had a big effect on anybody who's particularly gay men, because it ratified in law that it was abhorrent and wrong to be gay, which in many circles now that's considered absurd, but that's what Section 28 did. It prohibited any education about homosexuality. And then even more chillingly for me, 2013, which is the year that Kitty Pryde goes from the X-Men back to the present to fix things in 1981, which is when I would have been 11. Is that that's the same year that my mother died, and she told me who my father was on her deathbed. So I remember being frightened by this magazine, by this comic book. It, like, absolutely terrified. It gave me nightmares. But actually, it turned out in certain ways. I mean, I've got a whole list of things, and I think I'll probably do something with this comic at some future date because it has so many parallels for me personally. But the phrase "secrets keep us sick" and "shame dies on exposure" is two things from two entirely different people who I know. Well, one of them I know who's in recovery, who said to me that he'd spent a lot of money going to, works in the city, without revealing any spent a lot of money going into therapy, but that was the one thing that the therapist gave him after spending thousands of pounds that he really hangs on to, that secrets keep us sick. That, you know, when as long as you hang on to secrets, which is what happened in my family of origin, it didn't just impact on me, it ruined my mother's life. I mean, my father was estranged, but my mother actually carried multiple sclerosis since she was about 24. And shame dies on exposure. Or maybe I've got this the wrong way around. Maybe it was anyway, but that was from a tarot reader I always follow on YouTube, a guy called Gregory Spott, who's so their phrases from recovery rooms, those last two lines.
Yeah,
it's a very long explanation, but there was a lot of thought that went into it.
There's a lot there. So how has this? How has these realizations, right? How have they played out for you in your sobriety, for want of a better word?
Well, a lot of people in addiction recovery will say how you have to get used to being uncomfortable with things, because we tend to drink on things or, you know, take drugs to fill the void, and also when we're dealing with difficult people, difficult situations, we'll just go and get slaughtered. I mean, it's kind of, that's what people do, you know, it's self-medication, isn't it? So that's what I now do through artistic practice. So, and I try to bore myself with these things, or repeat them to death, or make them ordinary, or satirize them, those kinds of things, so that they don't have that traumatic hold on them anymore, and that instead what I'm get to a point of is that I can situate them as that was that awful thing that happened to me when I was like 13 years old, every day at school, kind of thing. Sexual abuse in some cases, you know what I mean? But it was, but at the same time, it's like I can't let that rule me. You know, but I have, and I certainly have. I mean, I was back in Staffordshire where I grew up only yesterday, and I was getting a bus that was like my school route, and all of those things that I was, and I'm also dealing with my where my mother lived and about what's going to happen to that house because she's died, but her partner has just moved into a care home. So there's this place where I know so well, and it doesn't have great associations. It's where my brother, who's died, and he was a drug dealer, and all the problems and all the dramas that were going on in my family that all came out of this situation, essentially, of what happened to my mother when she was 14. Because of that's how everything kind of fell apart, and secrets were a big part of that. Nobody was telling anybody the truth, and so there was, yeah. But it was. I was really glad to be on this bus and to be traveling and thinking, I'm grown up now, and I'm not affected by. Somebody was talking about me behind me on the bus, but instead of being in this state of fear, which is what I would have been as a child, and not knowing what these things about me, kind of thing, I was like, oh well, she's just an irritating person who's got nothing better to do than make comments on me dropping some money on the bus, and I was okay with it. But that's probably the first time I've been able to be like that. And that's been one of those things about being in recovery, because I can kind of deal with life better. I mean, and that's common for anybody, I think, who's been addicted to anything. And I'm not alone in this, but I was drinking pretty heavily for like 30 years. So that's a lot of unlearning to do with that, or relearning about how to be and whatever. Rather than trying to mask it and cover those things up with booze or alcohol or weed or whatever,
Yeah. So I completely lost my train of thought there. I was going to ask you a question about AA and how that had helped you. Because AA has quite a profound kind of spiritual element to it, right? Yeah. And what I'm meaning here by spiritual is the essence of who we are. I mean, we are spirit, and that's really hard to explain because our brains are made for things, and spirit isn't a thing, right? Yeah. Like you can't put it.
Yeah.
This is one of the. I think that was one of my early kind of things about the primal wound. Well, the primal wound is made by a knife, right? A wound is made by a knife, but you can't cut air, right?
It's a psychic knife, yeah.
A psychic knife. Yeah. A psychic knife. So how has, I never thought about that one. So I'm going to have to think about that one. How has AA and sobriety helped you heal that psychic wound, or did the healing of the psychic wound come first and the sobriety came later? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I completely owe AA a lot, I really do. I'm not that frequent an attendee at the moment, and I'm also okay with that, because I think I get out of creating and being okay with being with myself, which is something I couldn't be for years and years. that I live a pretty good life. And I think I'd done quite a lot of work on myself a long time before uh, I got to the point of sobriety or wanting to get sober. I kind of had to kind of live, But AA's been. There were two things really, because I'd been getting sober for since 2018, but I went into recovery rooms at the end of it was August 2021 actually, and I completely followed the program. And there are two things I would accredit AA for, because I definitely wanted to be sober. There was no budging on that. Life had already greatly improved by me being sober. I was even sober in lockdown for most of it, which most people find incredible. But it was spirituality was one of them, and community. So and I've made some really good friends who I feel really close to, kind of thing. And so that community of other people who'd understood that experience of what it's like made me question all kinds of things about all my other relationships. So I've lost a lot of friends. That's quite common. I'm quite good at making them, but I also really lacked boundaries. So people think I'm their best friend. I barely know them, kind of thing. But that was because coming out of my people pleasing thing. So AA really taught me about how to sweep my side of the street and how to identify my role in things. And part of that for me was also just being able to go, I'm not accepting that. This is like, these people are asking unreasonable demands on me, but then I'd laid the table so that they could do that. And the spirituality side of it, again, I mean, I was fairly, like I said to you over coffee, it was like I was fairly woo-woo before I even got to AA rooms. I mean, I switched off Sky News in lockdown and started watching astrology and tarot and because it was something I could control. Do you know what I mean? It was something, and of course all of that is infused with the idea of spirit, the universe, God, goddess, whatever. So when I got to the AA rooms and we're doing the Serenity Prayer, I know a lot of people who enter recovery rooms really struggle with the spirituality side of it. But then I hadn't even really grown up in a particular faith, so I hadn't really been put off any. And also, it's not religious; it's spiritual. So the genius about what the Bills wrote in the books is that it's God in the way that you understand him, it, whatever. So yeah, so I was already fairly okay with the idea that there's a higher power, because I look around for angel numbers all the time. So it's kind of like it's quite tame, really, kind of having to kind of follow 12 steps and believe that there is something, because I'm looking for coincidences all the time, and I think you do that as a creative anyway. So but I'm not in any way going to try and underplay. I mean, AA really was such a turning point in kind of me being able to help position myself in a way that I probably hadn't been able to before, because of the information not being readily available to me up until 10 years ago. But even finding out, I mean, obviously finding out something like I did about my own origins is pretty heavy duty. So I kind of forgive myself that I drank heavier after that, and was in a really quite destructive relationship with another alcoholic, and those kinds of things. I got out in time, but it took a few years really to kind of start to let those things settle and kind of start to understand it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Serenity Prayer, because I'm in a few Facebook groups for adoptees, and occasionally I'll post something, but not very often. Occasionally I'll comment on something. There was so there's a podcaster and fellow podcaster, and I've been on her podcast, she's been on mine, called Melissa Brunetti on the west coast of the States. And she put a post in a group yesterday saying, what, in your opinion, do adoptees need? And a big open question like that, the floodgates just opened. I saw it. I think I saw that about 6 o'clock UK time. By this morning, there were 55 comments on it. And I put something which I can't remember exactly what I put. I think yeah. I can't, I literally can't remember the first thing I put, but I'm looking at it again this morning. What struck me in the 55 responses is how many of those responses were external. So people, there were some genius quick ones, right? What do adoptees need? Somebody put a home. And I thought, well, that's genius. And yeah, they've got a home, right? So maybe they need a safe home. Who went? But a lot of them. So, one of them was to be heard. I thought, well, I've been trying to bend the world to my will for quite a long time. And you talked about repetition and banging the head against a brick wall. I did that for a very long time. And when I realized, something happened for me, and I realized that I had an insight, right? Something happened to me, and I realized, let's try another wall, right? And see, let's try a door this time, see if it opens, but this need, to be heard, and I thought, well, how much to be heardness do we need? That's an infinite scale, and we're relying on the external world to change rather than looking what within. So as this kind of was flashing through my head this morning, I thought about that, and I'd forgotten that it was called the Serenity Path. So that's what I put as my second comment, and I thought, because hopefully that might, and then I followed it up, I think, by saying, look, I've done this, so I'm not wagging. I'm talking from experience of my own errors, rather than some place of, I'm a blooming genius and I've never done that. So there's some humility in that. But I wonder what you make of all that and this external stuff that we seem to need to change.
I mean, the Serenity Prayer is genius. I mean, it just answers everything. There are some things you can control, and then there are other things you just can't. And that's where you let go and let God. That's where you pray for an answer. And sometimes you just have to go, I don't know what to do about this. But our ego, our flesh bodies are the things that on these brains that we've developed, with all the faults and all the things and all the scripts that we've had embedded in them for years and years and years, will tell us that no, this is what we're going to do and all that kind of thing. And that is and that was the bit I really couldn't get initially when I joined AA. I would join it, but when I started going to AA meetings. And then you work through the steps with your sponsor, and I have a great sponsor who's 22 years sober, and he was, but I'm like, why? What is this? You just you kind of give it up to. I just couldn't understand the thing of surrendering. And I went to this. I think that's step 3. I really should know them better off by heart, and I don't. But it's the. But I remember because you do service, you're recommended to do service when you do AA, and I just did what I was told, which was a very good thing. And so I would be waiting outside, and I was outside the city meeting, and I was like, what does it mean, get out of your own way? I just couldn't understand it. Then I realized this was my home group, and I'd been going there for a long, long time. Well, several months and whatever. And I was like, what's this getting out of your own way? And there was this huge articulated lorry on which had never been there before. It was like an early morning meeting. It was just in front of me. And so every time somebody walked past, I had to get out of the way. And then suddenly I was honestly one of those moments where I'm pondering, I don't really get this about steps. What is this getting out of your own way thing? And there it was in front of me. When there's something that's just so big in front of you that you just don't know the answer to it, that's when, instead of thinking we can solve it or we can fix it, we can break it, remake it, all those kinds of things, there are sometimes you just have to go, this will just be, and it will just work out. And that to me is serenity. And I think as adoptees, we're probably going to have those similar tendencies, that because so many things were out of our control, that fundamental psychic wound of that attachment to our mother. I don't want to get hang on the word of attachment or things like that, but it was gone and we had no control over that. So take that away, and then we'll spend a good time of our lives trying to fix that in some way. I'm talking about we. I mean me. This kind of situation. I can't really speak for anybody else, but I think that's probably where I would tend to have those controlling tendencies, and being able to just go, sometimes, like for example, I've just had this long period with the husband of my mother, where he's just spiraled out of control, and but being sober and having done the steps and having done all this work, I remained fairly calm about it. Whereas it would have been such a bigger deal, and it would have been a bigger drama, and I'd have been really, it's not like I wasn't resentful and that I haven't moaned about it, all those kinds of things, but it's not been I just knew that there would come to a point where it would get sorted, and and I was able to remain rational and calm. And me, probably about 10 years ago, would have struggled to do that, I think. And that's where I can see the progress, not the perfection, as we say in the recovery rooms. I think there's a lot of similarities, and obviously actually one of the reasons I joined or started going to AA meetings was a friend of mine who was already attending AA meetings had said to me that when I told him about this project I was doing about people who were brought up in kinship care, this friend of mine said, "Oh, there's lots of people in the recovery rooms who were brought up by their grandparents." And I thought, oh, that'd be a good way to reach them. Not thinking that I was I was also an alcoholic. I was drinking again at that time, kind of thing, and thinking I was okay. Funnily enough, a few months later, it's like, yeah, well, I'll go and meet them then, because that's me too, kind of thing. So I'm sure that a lot of people who are adopted will struggle with things like addictions as well, to perhaps a more acute degree than somebody who was brought up by their birth parents.
Yeah, the statistics bear you out, and that's one of the reasons that we've gone that way in our conversation today. But it's been a evolving kind of thing. We didn't have a plan. I knew that we were going to start off with, why don't you talk about trauma, but we've led it where it needs to go, or it's gone where it's we've given up. I've given up on it, right? I knew I had a starting point. I didn't have a destination in mind, but like the fact that the Serenity Prayer, I put that on a Facebook post this morning, and that's a AA thing, like there's a certain kind of somebody on our side.
Yeah, and I don't believe in coincidences now. I think that those kinds of things happen all the time. That I didn't know that you'd written that in a comment, quite truthfully. So I do believe that there is a kind of collective. We connect in all kinds of ways, and that we meet the people we're supposed to meet at the time we're supposed to meet. And it's also a thing of, I grew up in an essentially very, very negative environment for reasons that were understandable. But then, so I was attracting into my life incredibly negative relationships, because I was putting that out there and then getting it back, funnily enough. So part of my daily work is about having to change that. So, because my automatic default will be to criticize people, and most heavily towards myself, kind of thing. But at least now I can kind of go, oh, that's that brain doing that again. And actually, when I'm criticizing somebody, which more and more these days, I'll do it just in my head rather than say it out loud. I'm now able to go, oh, the reason I'm criticizing them is because I'm guilty of that myself. Do you know what I mean? And there's a phrase in the recovery rooms that when you point the finger at one person, when you're pointing the finger at somebody, there's three fingers pointing back at you, which is just so true, So, but these minds we have are just terrible things. We really should try and, quiet them as much as possible. You know,
That's the next interview. What else would you like to share that I've not asked you about, Leon?
yeah, I mean, my particular angle on this is kinship care, because that's what grew up in. I didn't even know what kinship care was until I thought about applying to this the Churchill Fellowship to go to America. And it's a different kind of, you know, obviously I did grow up with my family of origin, and there are definitely advantages to that. I wouldn't try and compare myself to somebody who's care experienced and has gone from foster care to foster care family. I just can't imagine what that experience is like. I think one of the things we tend to have, because I have talked to a lot of people who were brought up by their grandparents or aunties, uncles, family friends, or whatever, is that there can be real tensions. Because the grandparents can often be resentful of the daughter or the children, you know, who couldn't look after their kid, and then it seemed quite common that quite often the birth mothers were infantilized because their mothers stepped in. So there was always definitely a bit of a dynamic going on between grandparents and grandparents and then, you know, their children who'd had children. But I do think as adoptees, as kinship care adoptees, certainly in the UK, we're only there are a couple of, there's a really good charity, Kinship, they're doing amazing work, but they focus on the grandparents, and quite often those of us brought up in those family situations, we're not known about, or our needs aren't kind of addressed, or there's nobody supporting us, and we do go through the loss of, you know, and often have difficult relationships with our birth parents if we know them. Well, I mean, we will know them in the most range because we build, but we tend to, I did see characteristics like we tend to really try and people please, or we tend to overachieve. And there's people who were brought up in kinship care. I mean, you can, Bill Clinton and Obama were both, you know, and Russell Brand. So he did the comedy routine Nan Kids, which I borrowed for a project that I did. You know, we're quite achievers in lots of ways, but I think it's partly because we're overachievers, because we're so anxious. You know, we've got a lot to prove, and I think that's partly because of kind of a lack of understanding of ourselves. Actually, that's kind of I think one of the things that's particular to children who have to be brought up by their grandparents. So yeah, that's the one thing I'd kind of want to mention.
I mean, what struck me at the start of the interview, I didn't say it, is that the environment, you talked about the environment was, I think you used a master of understatement to me. It was like, you were marinated in shame.
That's, yeah, I mean, and then I turned out gay as well. I mean, can't even start on that one here, but you know, during that time, which was particularly acute, you know, it's probably what it's often been compared now to what trans people are experienced by greater visibility. That was definitely happening as well, but it was also very, very accepted. You know, there was no social media. There was just like newspapers, and so it was not only that I grew up in a village of a particular town, I was also quite obviously gay, and that's just like, do you want to throw anything else more at me? I was a very depressed teenager, really, so I just have to pat myself on the back for kind of getting through it. And but then, you know, had all these experiences not happened to me, then I wouldn't have this perspective on life. I wouldn't be doing these things. I am very proud of the things that I've done, and the work that I make and everything. I think I've got a lot of interesting things to say and do and create. And I know that that's had a really positive effect on lots of people. They both who are, you know, kinship care adoptees and in other realms of my life as well. So these things make us what we are, don't they? So, you know, it's nice. And there's also something nice about being my age and everything being new and me going into new things. And you know what I mean? It's kind of, you know, I've met artists who've been being artists since their 20s who are really jaded at my age. And I'm like this kind of bouncing, irritating bunny that's just, still kind of, got to be a bit Duracell. That's probably a very British reference, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Advertising of a certain time, but yeah, Duracell.
Brilliant. And you do the way that you do it, it is, whether it's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, it is fascinating the kind of the way you do it. And so I would encourage your listeners to check out the website, and because the way this art has an ability to beat the bounces of the brain, and get around you, sneak around those belief things, and goes. I'm going to do another advert. Goes to the place that other beers can't reach. Can't do that.
Not in very good taste, though, is it, Simon?
Not very good taste, no. Like my one. So I came up with this a while ago. What was it? Trauma is a toxic cocktail of fear, insecurity, and shame. But we are the glass, not its contents. And after I'd posted that, I thought, oh, that's not going to go down well with some people. But it's the metaphors to me, and your metaphors of art. I mean, it's how we express this stuff.
And fear is the number one thing that when you go through the whole thing of steps with at AA, it's the thing that it always boils down to is that the alcoholic, the addict, is struggling with fear. So that's it's interesting that's because fear is the opposite of love, isn't it? And and acceptance and those kinds of things, and fears are usually things that are created in our heads, they're not reality. That's, I suppose, actually going back to your earlier question, that's what I've really got out of being in AA.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Leon. It's been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Been an absolute pleasure, Simon. Really has. Yeah. It's good to meet you again. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, listeners. We'll speak to you again very soon. Cheers. Bye.